Hello and welcome, everyone, to the Nasher's 360 Speaker Series. I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and I thank you all for coming to what promises to be a thoughtful and relevant discussion. We always look forward to Dallas Art Fair Weekend as an opportunity to create dialogue around what is happening in the art world right now. This year, our panel will focus on the new and innovative ways galleries, auction houses, PR firms, and other institutions are connecting artists with the market. Leading this conversation is our moderator, Jori Finkel, who will introduce our other panelists and expand upon today's topic in just a moment. Finkel is a regular contributor to the culture pages of the New York Times and serves as the West Coast correspondent for the art newspaper. She was previously the staff arts reporter for the Los Angeles Times and senior editor of Art and Auction magazine. She has also given talks and led panels at venues ranging from the Getty Museum to Art Basel Miami Beach. Some of her favorite topics include the history of photography, artist activism and feminism, Dada poetry and performance, and, most germane today, new developments in contemporary art and the art market. On behalf of the Nasher, I thank all of you for joining us today, and I'm sure you're as eager as I am to enjoy a lively and insightful conversation. So without further ado, please welcome Jori Finkel and share a warm round of applause for our panel.
Charlotte Burns, to your right, is the editor of Art Agency Partners, a division of Sotheby's. She was also my boss up until a year ago at the art newspaper. Where she was previously the US News and Market editor for the art newspaper, as well as a regular correspondent for publications such as The Guardian and Monocle. Previously, she worked with the London dealer Anthony Dauphin on special projects. For several years, she was a consultant at the cultural communications agency Bolton & Quinn, and she also worked at Hauser & Wirth in London. Next to her, we have Doug Woodham, who has a new book. Do you have it with you? This is not a book signing, but he has a new book that's out this week. He is the author of Art Collecting Today, Market Insights for Everyone Passionate About Art. And he brings a unique perspective to the art market from his lifelong interests in art, business, and collecting. He's a trained economist with a PhD from the University of Michigan, who served as Christie's President of the Americas. He is currently on the board of the arts venture Twyla. Earlier in his career, he was a partner with McKinsey, working primarily with asset and wealth management clients. And he continues his advocacy for collectors by advising private clients on legacy planning associated with their art collection. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
And then Sara Fitzmaurice, who is the founder, CEO, and president of FITZ & Co., founded the firm in 1995 to work exclusively in advancing arts and culture internationally. Over the past 20 years, she has advised more than 100 international organizations and corporations engaged in the arts. Very important roster of clients that she's built over the years. And her expertise is strategic public relations and marketing for a wide range of clients, including museums, art fairs, foundations, galleries, online platforms, and brands that support the arts. So welcome to all of our panelists. And thank you, Anna, and thank you, Jeremy Strick, for organizing this today. I'm going to sit down and talk, if that's okay with you guys. And I thought I would open the panel today by sharing a story, always dangerous, really a memory from my early days in journalism in the art world. And so we're winding the clock back now about 20 years, just to date me. About 20 years ago, I took a job as an editor of an art magazine in New York called Art and Auction. And it was only maybe 6 or 7 months into the job. This is a very clear memory for me, some things just blur as time passes. But 6 or 7 years into the job, we published an article on the changing gallery landscape in New York. This article had a map in it, a map of a new art neighborhood called Chelsea. You may have heard of it. This map had a total of 7 galleries. It was a comprehensive map, including featuring Matthew Marks, who was the pioneer as far as I'm concerned, and an article to go with it. But I remember this map very clearly because one Saturday morning I woke up and I said, I have to see these galleries for myself. So I did what you did at the time, which is I tore out the map. I didn't have nobody had a smartphone yet. I didn't have an app that I didn't have Google Maps. Google was in its first year, I think, 20 years ago. And so I tore out this map and I walked around Chelsea trying to find these galleries. And it wasn't always easy to find them. You know, they were mainly auto body shops at the time. And I remember my boss at the time, who Sara knows as well, had a line about Chelsea as it was his favorite place to see art because you could go for such a long walk. Almost like the Nasher here. You could take a long walk and get fresh air in between galleries. So I think about this memory from time to time because it feels kind of quaint and nostalgic to me, really for two reasons. One is that I had no way of knowing at the time, I really didn't, that Chelsea would explode and that there would be a gallery expansion, an explosion of such order that hundreds of galleries would move in over the next 10, 15 years. And the gallery expansion explosion in Chelsea is really, one sign, one part of a larger professionalization of art that was occurring in major cities across the globe and brings us art fairs like the one we have in this city this week. I also had no way of knowing that this magazine that I worked for, where you could tear a map out, was a dinosaur. I mean, maybe we had a hint of it at the time, but that magazines would become, a real victim to the acceleration and digitization of information that we've all seen happen in our lifetime. And so I bring this up by way of example and also to set the stage a little bit for some of the changes that have occurred over the last 10 to 20 years. So it's something to keep in mind as we're discussing new ways of promoting and marketing art. And I thought I would open the panel with a question of each of our panelists where I'm curious, in your experience in the art world, in your history in the art world, or given your history in the art world, what do you think is the biggest change in the way that artists are promoted and marketed? And if you could single out, one change that you feel is really instrumental, I'd be curious in hearing from each of you on that.
Would you like me to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming to listen to us today. I think the biggest change currently is that everything's decentralized. There are no rules anymore. Galleries, auction houses, artists themselves, they are all taking marketing on themselves directly. And to complement your memory lane, I will just add one anecdote, which is we do public relations and marketing. Probably 15 years ago, the grande dame of the art market, I won't say who, but very advanced in years, very prestigious, approached me and said, please come in and talk with us about public relations. So I came in, I gave my pitch, early internet days, and she said, fantastic, I want to hire you. And I was like, oh my God, this is so exciting, so prestigious. She said, there's just one thing. I said, what is that? Nobody can know you're working for us. Which shows a tremendous sign. Now the promotion of art and artists is everywhere, and it's just out there, and it's very transparent, and there's no apology for it, just like corporate brands.
So a memory and then an idea. So memory for me is I went to the Whitney Biennial in 1973. So it was the first time that I went to that biennial, and I still have the catalog at home. And it was interesting because if you look at that catalog today, so many of the artists that we know of were in that show. But interestingly, in that catalog, they listed the address of every artist, so you could get in touch with them directly. So it was Robert Smithson, Frank Stella, Joan Mitchell, Richard Sara, and their address was there. I'd say 8 out of 10 times it was their home address, not the gallery address, sometimes the phone number. And you could go to the front desk, the information desk at the Whitney, and ask, what's the price of the painting or the sculpture? And so I have notes of what paintings cost. And so there was this magnificent, huge, 10 by 18 foot Joan Mitchell painting that was for sale for, I think, $40,000 at the time. So to just sort of build on that, I think what's changed dramatically is, in my mind, the cost to produce information and distribute it about art has plummeted. Because back in the 70s, even the 60s and 80s, when an artist monograph was published, it meant something. It was a moment in time where there was a scholar, there was a curator of note, a book was created, it became a Bible, it became a representation of that artist. And so if you were a collector, your source of information was by and large those catalogs and curators. Today, the cost for a gallery to produce a book has plummeted. The cost to hire a writer has plummeted. So I just think everybody's overwhelmed with information, and it's hard. It's like a signal noise problem. There's all this noise. It's trying to figure out how to extract a signal from all that noise on which artists are doing something that's really interesting and relevant, and which may stand the test of time, because there's a predisposition on every writer's part now to try and create the impression that every artist is interesting and relevant and breaking new ground, and the vast majority are not. So I just see there's a huge signal noise problem in the marketplace today related to information, and it's just driven by the fact that the cost to produce and distribute information has plummeted in the art world like in every other industry.
I think my big change really builds on what Doug was saying. It's to do with this idea of the money that's come into the marketplace since then has changed the way that we think about art, and it's changed the conversation. So it's fascinating hearing you talk and saying that the Whitney would tell you the price. Like now, if they did that, that would be a front page story for a newspaper talking about how they were complicit in the market. Right. Because we've got stricter lines now, even though they're sort of fictional. There are also these sort of guidelines. I think the biggest change is that with the influx of money that's come in, so much capital in the system, there hasn't been a broadening of interest. There's been a sort of funneling of focus onto a few brand names, essentially. And I remember this when I was working in art PR, that you could have 23 artists working on an interesting project, but people just wanted to hear about Tracy Emin, or like the names that they recognized, that they knew would sell papers. Because of the media landscape, the competition is much higher, so people need to get the readers in the door, and they don't really care about the most interesting project in the piece. They just care about the biggest artist. And I understand that as someone who then became a journalist, because you need that name in the headline to get people to read. And I think the same is true in the market, that there isn't that, there hasn't been a broadening, and the market's becoming increasingly top-heavy. And I think the biggest change is therefore the kind of evolution of the gallery system, and all of those things mean that there's a sort of squish or pressure on the middle, and that was really a space where artists could have the room to fail, or galleries could maybe have one or two artists that really made the money for the gallery and allowed them to take on other artists who were never going to make money, but maybe were important artists, just not necessarily in a commercial sense. And I don't know that those artists are getting that support now, because the artists who make the money for the galleries make so much money that they leave and they find a bigger gallery to support them, or they just manage everything themselves and have a different arrangement financially with a gallery. So there's less, there are fewer dividends being shared by fewer people. There's more money being made, but it's going to fewer places.
That's interesting. I think one thing you all touched on in different ways is the kind of branding of artists today, or artists as a brand. And that there are some artists who have achieved that in kind of extraordinary ways. And we see it outside of the art world as well, in terms of kind of celebrity culture and what it means, to be famous for being famous, and how then more fame accrues to you and more headlines. I think you described really well. Do you guys see alternatives to this? Is this a condition that every artist aspires to? Is this what the galleries aspire to? Do you feel like it's a system now that is made to, create famous artists in a way? Or do you feel that, the art market is much more diverse than that, and maybe that's just what we happen to read about in, some of the coverage?
Right. Well, actually, a few fun facts as part of doing research for my book. I tried to estimate how many living artists today are making $1 million or more a year as one sort of benchmark. And I came up with a number of maybe 300 to 500. who are making at least $1 million or more a year. And I think, to your point, there's a small group that might be making 10, 15, 20 million a year. But so depending upon your views about the art marketplace, that might strike you as a large number or a small number. But let's look at the other extreme. Average household income in the United States is less than $60,000. This is the best time in the history of the world to be a living artist. The demand for art has shifted dramatically. There's so many people now who have the means and desire to buy art. And so there's so many people now who can make a living as an artist. So if you use a household income number of $60,000, and it's not even that, I think it's like $56,000. So you get out of a major metropolitan area, there are a lot of people who can be artists now. It's gotten so extreme though. I think there's so many people who are artists who do want to be one of those 300 to 500, who want to get to the top of the pyramid. And it's manifesting itself in that there's massive entry of artists. And my favorite factoid was if you look at the acceptance rate at Yale in their MFA program, or at Columbia's MFA program, the acceptance rate is below the acceptance rate to be an undergrad at Harvard or MIT. So there's just this clamoring of people to be artists. So I do think it's a little bit like Hollywood, where there are a few actors and actresses that make a boatload of money. That drives people to want to be actors or actresses. The fact that a lot of people can be artists now and put bread on the table, I think is a great thing. I think it's a terrific thing. I think there's just a little too much obsession about the top of the pyramid. And there is a bifurcated art market, but I think we should take pleasure in the fact that there's so many people now who are interested in art and having art in their homes and art in their lives. And it's making it possible for more people than ever before to pursue it as a career.
And I think picking up on what you're saying, when I was coming of age in the art world, which was at the same time as Jori 20 plus years ago, artists became artists it was truly out of a passion. I was having a conversation in Los Angeles the other day with Doug Aitken, who's our same generation, and Doug said when he first moved to New York, and he was in New York making art, living on the cheap, it never occurred to him that somebody would buy these things. It wasn't part of the conversation, and that was I was dumbstruck. As a reminder, now
what a lovely thought and idea.
It was incredible. And he just
coming
was
from Doug,
coming from Doug,
right?
of all people, who is the top of the pyramid
Yeah.
now, and good for him. He's very talented. And works very hard. But I think what's changed is now there are these drivers. I want to be an artist, and I want to be a superstar, and I want to make money. It wasn't like that 20 years ago, but I think that's also part of the celebrity culture that we're living in. It's not just in the art world.
So how does that change the way you think about promoting an artist? How much harder is it to promote an artist than it was when you started out in this field?
I think what's changed is that there are so many ways that one has to promote an artist. If you look at what it costs to run a gallery these days, 20 years ago it was very straightforward. There was maybe an ad in art forum, there was an invitation, there was a dinner, maybe you did a publication. Now the expectation is massive production costs, spectacle kinds of events, intense social media campaigns, digital promotion of those artists. You can add on and layer it, but it's the coming together of all of these factors that really go into promotion, and it's no different than promoting a movie or the launch of a luxury brand. Mm-hmm. What that does to an artist is I think they have to have a pretty strong moral compass or visual compass about their creative practice to really stay true, because it can get very thin very fast, and they can get wrapped up in the hype of their own promotion.
There's also a demand for product in a way that there didn't used to be. If you were an artist before, you could be the kind of artist who made 5 or 6 paintings a year, and that might be fine, especially if no one was buying them anyway. Like, it didn't really make a difference. Whereas now, if you're a gallery, you need your artist to produce, because you have, on the one hand, the declining gallery model that people aren't going to Chelsea as much as they were, hand in hand with the rising costs. So you're running a business whose profit margins are harder and higher than they ever were. And the pressure on you to take part in major international events like the art fairs, the biennials, you need your artists to be there because the art world, as it's become, the market, not necessarily the world, even though they converge, has become richer and more international, and people are more peripatetic. So they may not go to Chelsea for their socializing, but they will go to Venice this summer at some stage, or Basel, or Documenta. You know, my Instagram feed this week is all Athens. And so people, or Dallas, obviously. So people
And a little
are,
Damien Hirst.
Yeah, and Damien as well. Which shows the global nature of things now, but those people aren't in the galleries of those artists. So you need your artists to make material. You need them to show large-scale stuff, because museums increasingly are part of this, that they need spectacle too to get people in the door. They're building these larger, more dynamic spaces. So artists either think on that huge spectacle scale, or they have to think in terms of an art fair booth, and also in terms of Instagram. So it's really interesting to think of how those things shape the art that we're seeing, because Instagram is, you know, you can't, like Agnes Martin would be a failure on Instagram. You need something that's sculptural, bold, bright, dimensional, you know, not muted and understated. And so it's kind of interesting to think about how people stand out.
Well, you seem to be predicting a kind of decline, even further decline in terms of the importance of the gallery. So maybe we could talk about that for a second. That the gallery isn't always the home of all these different strategies that Sarah's talking about, whether it's, you know, all the different social media strategies. The gallery isn't necessarily doing it. The galleries are often still, you know, just focused on their collectors and sending the emails, or, you know, sending the links to their collectors with the images that they could buy, and doing the art fairs to participate or in a larger, kind of reach a larger audience. You know, what you're talking about, does this spell the end of the gallery, but maybe the end of the gallery's reign as this kind of central place for the promotion and distribution of artists?
I don't think so. I think they'll remain at the center. I think, to pick up on your point, there'll be the few mega galleries, I think, will just hoover up a lot of the talent. The middle market will probably decline, and then you just have a feeder system of smaller galleries. I went in search of an artist who had built a successful career totally outside the gallery system. And interestingly, I wasn't able to find that many. I mean, I did find one fascinating artist named C.J. Henry, who's built her entire profile on Instagram. And she grew up in Australia. 2013, she decided to drop out of architecture school because she hated doing all the software work associated with being an architect, and decided to give it a go, spending a year as an artist. And this is in 2014, she started doing these hyper-realistic drawings of consumer products, posted them on Instagram. Within 6-12 months, had 100,000 followers. Everything sold immediately. Then she had a couple of pop-up shows, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne. They sold out. She moved to New York. She now has 6,000 people on her waiting list. And her drawings 2 years ago were like 5 to 50,000. Prices have gone up. So she works outside the traditional vernacular, if you will. But interestingly, she was the only one that I could find that was totally on Instagram, and that was it. I think a lot of people are using it as an amplification effect.
There's some examples from like SachiArt.com, where they're using they're using the online gallery space. The artists are probably because they can't get the kind of real gallery yet, and they have 5 or 6 artists who make 6 figures with them every year. Which, you know, again, they're just a handful of examples.
Exactly, just a handful. Yeah, I think CJ's might soon be in that exalted 300 to 500.
There's Tavares Strachan's an artist who I think of as working outside that system. And he makes major, huge, expensive work, like in Prospect, New Orleans. Biennial, he had a barge, which you've probably seen somewhere on a photograph, because it's eminently photographable, of saying, "You belong here." And if it was a barge that they repurposed as a work of art to float down the river.
And he doesn't have a gallery, Charlotte?
He said to me that he doesn't have a gallery. I think he works with galleries, but I think he picks and chooses his work in a sort of jigsaw project-like way, where he'll work with a gallery, he'll work with a private donor. He's not tied into the system. He just uses the system in quite smart ways to get, either commissions or, he'll go to different people for different funding. It's more bespoke. And so he hasn't bypassed it, but he just works in this different way where he figures out different arrangements for depending on the work. Different works need different things, is how he described it.
Interesting.
Another thought that occurred to me too was that maybe this is a generational thing, because we recorded a podcast recently with an art dealer, and we were talking to him about the changes in the gallery since he launched in 1994 in New York. And he was saying things like he felt very old, he felt like things were changing, he felt like he needed to reconsider. And it occurred to me that we talk about the middle market, but a lot of this is also middle age. And so some of the innovation will come from people saying, I either want to keep doing this or I don't, and I'll make a change. And so I think the system is changing. I think I agree with Doug totally. It won't ever become, I think galleries will always be very central. I just think that lots of dealers are asking themselves questions about whether this is the lifestyle they want, or if there is a different way of doing that. Whether it's like Gavin Brown is in Harlem and is thinking of ways to be more engaged with that community. Or Joel Maesler is another dealer I spoke to who's just leaving New York to go to the Hamptons because he figures there's 3 dead months in Manhattan anyway, so why not have 6 dead months in the beach for a lower rent and all the collectors holiday there. So he's trying this totally different model where he now says he's getting people offering him secondary market Picassos, which he certainly never got on the Lower East Side. So
don't you think there are two trends taking place at once in terms of galleries, where we do see some galleries getting bigger and bigger, kind of on the Gagosian model or Hauser-Wirth model in LA, where they are as big as a Home Depot, like literally. But there's also the trend of some mid-market galleries or smaller galleries getting smaller and smaller in terms of their footprint, and that may be generational too. Like the idea, why do you need a great big house? You can rent instead of own, or what has been very successful so far in San Francisco, this gallery complex called Minnesota Street Project. And it brought a bunch of galleries that could no longer afford the downtown San Francisco real estate prices together, and in one building, under one roof. And one of the things they did was they said, you don't need the big spaces. We'll keep one big flexible space up front so that you can, if you really have a big sculpture show where you need the big space, you rent that out. But for most of your shows, you don't need that big space. You take a small space, and you don't need storage because we'll have storage in the warehouse next door. And you don't need catering facilities because we'll have a joint catering. And it seemed to me a really progressive model. And I think the galleries, they're really happy so far because of this idea that they aren't getting foot traffic anyway. They're gone half the time at art fairs. That the gallery could become a smaller and smaller physical space just as it needs to expand digitally and socially and in
and
other
I think
ways.
that, going back to your original point, Jori, about the art magazines being a dying dinosaur or print magazines, I think the same is true for the traditional gallery model. But there are all of these new gallery models, and I think the point is for galleries to survive and thrive, they do need to stay abreast. They need to embrace what does it mean to be a gallery in the 21st century, and then there's all these paradigms around them that are set up. You can't get into the Art Basel shows if you don't have the big, beautiful footprint in a signature city or an emerging market city if you're not doing publications. So then decisions have to be made. Some galleries are very, very strong on digital. One of the conversations we're having with some of our gallery clients today is, how are the auction houses getting to clients? How are they using their client relationship manager or CRM to really target and get to their clients? And why don't galleries understand that? It's the way Net-a-Porter is getting to their clients. How can we take this back as an agency and help galleries learn how to do this? That's very cutting edge and very 21st century thinking in terms of a sales technique, but the galleries that we're working with that are doing this are having tremendous results.
How do you do it? How do you?
It's very complicated and boring to get into on a panel, but I can talk with you afterward. But it is taking models from the successful sales businesses and just applying them to the art world. I think in the art world, gallery system and auction house system and Doug Christie's was a leader in changing this. There's a lot of sales marketing to the whales, the very top of the pyramid, the people buying the $10 million and up works. But then there's this whole very large middle market that nobody's talking to. So if I'm a gallery and I've met someone at an art fair and I've sold maybe 2 things to them, I stop talking to them. But if I talk directly to them and I come up with a strategy to talk to them, very likely I'm going to re-engage, and I might sell them 3 more things at 100 or 200. Am I right?
Right. I mean, just to build on that, if you look at the buyer base in the marketplace, and suppose you just segmented people who are buying an object of $500,000 or more. So we're talking sort of rarefied air. There are not that many of them. They're just not that many. I mean, we're talking less than 100,000 people worldwide, probably. So it's very, very small. But if you can monitor what they're looking at, if you can understand what they covet and offer it to them, or you know that they bid on a Liechtenstein work on paper but weren't successful, so then you go back and offer them something privately. I mean, there are all sorts of information pockets that you can play with that can make it possible for you to serve those, let's say, 100,000 people more effectively. All of the major auction houses, all of the main galleries, the mega galleries, it's an arms race to actually be in touch with those folks. And that's the cost to serve has soared because of the dinner parties, the events, the catalogs. It's like everybody's doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on a very small group of people. Everybody else is to some extent being overlooked. So I think the path forward for a lot of galleries is stop coveting that part of the pyramid, because it's just fool's gold to try and go after, because there's so many people that are trying to go after that short list of names. Try and figure out how to enlarge the market, how to make it easier for people to talk with you, make it easier for people to understand your artist. I mean, think about the experience that probably a lot of you have had going to a gallery booth at an art fair or at a gallery. It's not that friendly an experience. It's not that easy to find out about an artist. I mean, the ethos of so many galleries is still an exclusivity one, as opposed to let's expand the market. So I think the top of the pyramid from a collector perspective is overserved. Everybody else is not even on a list. So go after them, but try to figure out how to make it a more enjoyable, fun experience to buy and connect with artists. And I think that might be a way forward for a lot of galleries.
Have access.
Have access, yeah.
You were talking before about the signal noise problem, and that could have been a good title for this panel as well. Signal noise. You know, how do you hear the signal? How do you, or on this end, for people who work behind the scenes, how do you amplify that signal so it breaks through the noise? And one of the things we've seen a lot, you know, I won't say just lately, but lately in terms of the Dana Schutz controversy that many of you may have read about, and kind of has overtaken any other kind of coverage of the Whitney Biennial this year, which is that one painter made a painting showing Emmett Till, the boy who was lynched in like 1955, I think. And there was a photograph at the time that showed his disfigured face, and she made a painting that was very abstracted of this and came under intense scrutiny. And there were protests even. With the argument that she, as a white woman, really didn't have the right to make this painting, and the painting should even be destroyed. And somehow this is just, it's like the gift that keeps on giving for newspapers and art magazines and the online blogs, and that everybody has weighed in on this at one point or another over the last 2 weeks. And so it's gotten me thinking more, you know, with the panel coming up, I started thinking about what's the role of controversy in amplifying this signal. Is, you know, does controversy help artists in the long run? I guess is one question I would throw out there. And two, are we junkies for controversy in a way? Do we need controversy because there's so much noise, perhaps? And then it gives us one thing to focus on and pay attention to, and one thing that can kind of cut across everything and engage people in conversation. And you mentioned Damien Hirst already, who is, it seems like there's another controversy brewing in Hearstland with a new installation he's done in Venice. Yeah, every 3 years, like clockwork. He can he can manufacture really big artworks that some people find important, but he can also manufacture the controversy that goes around. Do we need that from artists today more than ever?
I think we need it in general. It's what drives all of us to consume media. And the media is a very powerful tool. And so do artists need it? It does help build brand and name recognition. And then in terms of the outcome, it is very much about how the artist handles it and how the institution handles it. And there are great case studies and there are disastrous case studies. And we were talking about one of the disasters as we were waiting to join the panel with Kelly Walker in St. Louis, appropriated images of sexualized African American women and made big sort of luscious paintings over them, but without any, and he's a Caucasian male, without any description, without any understanding that there would be huge reactions and sensitivity to this art. And there was an outcry for censorship, which in my opinion is never the way to go. But the artist and the institution were so ill-equipped to handle this that they bungled it again and kept bungling it.
And his voice was nowhere in this discussion,
his voice was
right?
nowhere.
He had no answers or
He had no
explanations.
answers. He hadn't thought it through. And so one of the things that our agency does is crisis communications, and a lot of it is preparedness. And when we worked on the Aspen Art Museum's Sai Kwao Cheng exhibition with desert tortoises with iPads on their back, there was an outcry from animal rights activists with actually false information. It was curious that GoPro brand was running a campaign at the same time with tortoises wearing GoPros, but nobody commented on that, which I thought was quite interesting. But we were able to come up with messaging, very carefully positioning the artist's intent. In this case, the artist just weighed in with a sort of provided quote, but it calmed down rather quickly. But we crave controversy, clickbait. I don't know if that's a term anyone in the audience is familiar with, but what drives traffic to these websites? And like no other time in history, there is this blurring of the boundaries between true editorial and advertising, and I'm sorry that holds true for political reporting as well. So I'll let my other panelists.
There's a couple of things about the Danish FITZ controversy. One thing that occurred to me is how perhaps it's to do with the time we're living in, where people are tense and there's a lot of disharmony and people feel that very strongly. My example for this is that I had arranged a panel discussion for our podcast on inequality in the art world. And a week before it was meant to happen, and I'd arranged it 6 weeks before, the Whitney Biennial controversy broke out. And so that then took over any other discussion because, of course, we had to talk about that. And it kind of occurred to me afterwards that maybe that was indicative of where we are, that there seems to be a kind of furore in the air, and people are angry, and there's places that you can direct that or not. So the Danish FITZ thing was interesting because it unfolded so fast because of social media. There were opinions on every angle on this thing, and they were all kind of the same. Should it be censored? Should it be banned? Should it be destroyed? Who has a right to talk about the pain of others? And these are really valid conversations to have in a moment where people are feeling like they don't have voices, and they're feeling that maybe their government doesn't respect them. And so I think those conversations are important. I also think that when a writer said to me that he wanted to write about it we have a section of the newsletter where someone talks about works that they see. And I said, my feeling was, and I didn't want to censor, that I didn't know if it was going to add anything. I felt like there were so many voices now all saying the same thing. And the only way it would be interesting, I thought we came up with together, was that it would be worth looking at whether you could ever now separate that painting from this controversy. Could you ever separate the Guernica from the Guernica? Could you separate the Bob Gober wallpaper from the controversy there. So some artworks, Roberta Smith wrote this in the New York Times, become locked in their moment of history and come to speak so much more than the artist intentioned. And I felt like that was the only way that I felt, because we covered it in the podcast, I just feel like I didn't want to write about it again and run an image that was so inflammatory, just rehashing a point of view on an argument that I felt had so many points of view. I didn't think it would be interesting editorial. I didn't think we were adding much more. And ultimately, it was really hard because the writer tried to write about it in like 300 words, which is kind of impossible. And the first 2 paragraphs were about the controversy. So I was like, essentially, we're making the point that you can't, not at this moment in history, unlock this from the work. So I'm not sure what that really tells us, but I just didn't feel we could add to it. It felt like everybody was writing about it because things can be inflamed. But there are real-time consequences. The staff, these are people's lives. People were very angry about it, and I felt a certain responsibility to not stoke flames unless there were maybe insight that would make that worth it. But just to get clicks, to me, felt like not really worth it, because how many clicks are we really going to get anyway? We're a kind of niche newsletter. It's not like I'm writing for the New York Post, so it's like a different thing.
And nobody's accused, Dana, nobody's accused the artist of doing this just for the controversy, but I think that's the other question I'm asking, is whether controversy has become a strategy for artists. I mean, I actually, having dinner here in Dallas, the first night I arrived on Thursday night, there was an artist who had a great line about the real victim in the Dana Schutz controversy being Jordan Wolfson. Well, Jordan Wolfson is the artist who makes work just, really to push buttons. And he has, his crazy, Huck Finn doll in the Whitney? Which sculpture is it in the Whitney? I haven't seen it.
Right, it's the VR, it's a video.
Oh, it's a VR, sorry.
It's like somebody, I didn't see it because people have told me it's so disturbing not to see it. And people who've come out of it were like, I didn't know what to expect. I went in, it said warning, but lots of things say that when there isn't really a need for the warning. And they came out saying I was super disturbed because it's homicide. You're watching almost, you're watching somebody kill somebody.
So with his work, there really, it has controversy built into the DNA of it. And the idea that he's the victim because he's not getting talked about now because something else, like a genuine controversy that touches on kind of race relations in this country has eclipsed it somehow. It seems funny to me. But do you see controversy as a strategy in this day and age?
Yes, but I guess let me answer it with 2 historical examples. Jesse Helms was a gift to Robert Mapplethorpe in his career. So Mapplethorpe, in the 70s and 80s, like amazing work. Inside baseball crowd in the art world loved him, but it was an inside baseball crowd. And so Jesse Helms was the gift of God. But another historical example, Modigliani. In 1917, Modigliani switched to a new dealer whose last name was Zubrowski. I always forget his first name. And up until then, Modigliani was painting portraits of fellow artists and folks in MoMA, none of who could afford to buy his paintings. So Zubrowski said, paint me some nudes, because I have a new show, and paint me some nudes. So the classic, iconic, reclining female nudes, of which Modigliani painted 22, he started painting in 1917, and they were in a show that Zubrowski hosted in a pop-up gallery in Paris. It was across the street from a police station. Guess what? They put a few nude paintings in the window. The police came by. Like a controversy ensued. The police decided to shut it down because of taste and morality. It ends up, most of the paintings didn't sell. I think there were like 2 drawings, and the dealer bought 3 for inventory. And the painting that sold to a Chinese billionaire a couple of years ago for $170 million was in that show and did not sell. So I just use that as an example. People have been trying to create controversy in the art world for a long time. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't think the Jesse Helms thing was something that Mapplethorpe sought. So the unexpected, I think, really helped him.
I think we're going to finish up our discussion on stage now to open it up for questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, Anna's going to walk around with the mic there. Thank you.
I believe on the open casket painting, there was something added that said this from the artist saying this painting is not for sale. It will never be for sale.
She said that to the press.
Oh, to the press.
It wasn't at all in the presentation of the painting at the Whitney. But,
okay, sorry.
But very quickly, because
Yes.
of just
So
what
would you
Sara
maybe
said,
comment on that
an
a little
important
bit?
comment. Maybe you want to take this question then.
Was there I didn't understand if there was a question.
Maybe if you could just kind of comment on that in the context of selling, and controversy.
Or how important was,
Sure.
what do you think of that response?
Yes, I think that that was very clever of Dana to come up with that response, because it shows that she is presenting something very authentic, and she's not looking to capitalize on the market or to benefit from the controversy that she didn't realize was created. So I think that was quite astute on her part.
There was an article by the writer Felix Salmon on this very subject, because he looked at the letter written by Hannah Black, who was the Berlin-based artist who initially wrote the letter protesting that was signed by other artists. And in it, he identifies a language of power and money, where he says that Hannah Black talks about the fact that this should not be sold and it shouldn't be entered into a museum. And so he questions whether, if Dana Schutz were an artist who weren't a successful artist on the market, would this be a controversy? It's because it's in the Whitney, it's because she's a successful artist that it's so offensive to some people. Whereas if she weren't gaining recognition or finance from it, whereas Dana Schutz had always said it wasn't going to be for sale before the Whitney. It wasn't a piece that she intended to sell. So it definitely, I think that the finances are part of the controversy. If we talk about Damien Hirst, it's a similar thing. That high prices create controversy. The marketability of art, artists can, with the best of intentions, make work that can be about the pain of others, and then other people may feel they're benefiting from that. So the money in the market itself is a controversial factor for a lot of people, I think, and colors the way that we see art. Is it worth it?
It stokes the flames of any criticism you might have of that painting would be magnified if you think she's going to make $1 million from it or $5 million from it.
Right.
So you think what she did was smart?
From a PR perspective, it was very smart.
Yeah, best thing she could have done?
Protecting, covering her, hedging her bet.
Would you have given her that advice?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Any other questions?
Who was the artist whose works you previously mentioned that was controversial and they depicted homicide? Which artist?
Oh, Jordan Wolfson.
Okay, thanks.
I didn't catch that.
Thank you all for your comments. I was wondering if you could talk, Doug, maybe a little more about cultivating that middle tier of collectors. Is it a function of galleries just not having the people power to do that? Because that seems somewhat labor intensive. How do you actually go after them if they are maybe the people who could be keeping the lights on a lot? Like, what's the sort of ROI? I mean, how do you do it? Are you emailing them? How, what does that look like exactly?
Well, we may all have different points of view on this, but I think it starts with recognizing most people walking into a gallery aren't sure what to buy or why to buy. And so I think the more you can, in simple, pragmatic prose, be able to describe why this artist is interesting and potentially important, I think to make it easy for that potential buyer to connect with the artist. Do a Skype call with an artist. I mean, artists are generally terrific at getting people to get intrigued with them. So I think it's simple prose that describes why the artist is interesting and important. Most gallery press releases are still too turgid and laden with 25-cent words. I think make it easy for you to connect with the artist. And I think using Skype or other ways makes it possible to do that in a cost-effective way. And then I think it's describe to people pricing and its logic and how you can buy things. The mystery, the voodoo of how you can get on a list is so off-putting to people. And I think it's a carryover of people aspiring to be at the top of the gallery pyramid and knowing that they do it. So, oh my God, the way I have to do is create an artificial sense of demand. I think dispense with that practice. Those are some of the things I would do.
I don't know if I agree.
That's good, good. I'm glad,
Because
good.
the role of a dealer is also, it's not just to sell the work, it's to place the work.
Right.
You know, it traditionally has been important to make sure that it ends up, it's shown in institutions like this, in places where you want to pass it on to the history books. So when you're telling somebody it's important, that's one thing, whereas if you have Jeremy Strick saying it's important as well, that's another thing. And so that that validification that comes with showing a work in those traditional matrices of success, whether it's biennials, whether it's museum collections, you want to make sure that your work, you're striking that fine line between getting your bills paid and making sure that there is demand, and also making sure it goes to the right people. So I think those lists are archaic and probably sometimes are artificial, but they also do serve a function. We're running an article on Sturtevant and her market. She's had a recent sort of rise in her market, and we were talking to her dealer, Tadeusz Ropak, who said that at the beginning of that interest, he was delighted and was selling everything, and then he realized that it wasn't going away. He thought it was a brief moment, and it's a little bit more long-lasting than that, so now he's not selling, apart from to Americans, and when he says Americans, he means major institutions, because she's always had more favor in Europe than she has in America. So he feels that the only way for her reputation to rise is to sell it to Americans who he thinks are significant. So he has a list of certainly desirables that he has in mind, I'm pretty sure. And even if a major English museum came along, I don't know if especially German, there's a lot of her work in Germany and France, I don't think he would sell there. So I think it's part of your job, actually, as the custodian of that work, to pass it into the right hands, even though that can sound pretentious. I think it's sort of how we find out about artists, is what survives history. And, the art, if paintings and art and video and sculpture are the remnants of our history, then we know about them because somebody put them in a good place.
Hi, I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of like artist-run spaces and also like non-commercial like project spaces and like how they play in this conversation that we're having here. Also, I run an artist-run space called Beef House. We have an opening tonight. If anyone wants to come.
I'm happy to take that one. First of all, congratulations on marketing your opening tonight. I think that was
Can you come up here? We'll get a chair.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a great take a chance with the mic. Artist-run spaces, I think, are very, very important. They become incubators. By running a space on a tight budget, typically, you can become a real incubator of new ideas without the pressures of the market or the pressures of getting into an art fair, et cetera. And I know for many Chelsea galleries and Los Angeles galleries, those are the kinds of spaces where new, young, raw talent is discovered. There's a fantastic space in Minneapolis where I'm from called Midway Contemporary, gave them a plug. And it is a space where a lot of, I think Jordan Wolfson maybe even had an early show there. I think that he might have, we'll have to check that. But at any rate, they do serve a very important purpose in the art world ecosystem.
My question is how much you can escape commerce, though, when it's all around you. Like how, I mean, you could probably answer this better than us in that sense. Like, to what extent do you think the artists that you work with strive for capital success, or are they striving for, art critical success? I think one of the dealers we interviewed recently said that an artist told him there's no art left in the West, which is obviously a little bit dramatic. But I thought it was an interesting thing, this idea that the web of commerce is now the system that we're in, to the extent to which you can make art that's really different and dynamic. Great art to emerge is, we had another thing on like why it's so difficult to pinpoint the great artists who have emerged since that sort of Matthew Barney moment. And I think that's a kind of problem, that it's somehow, the system has become so much better, you can make money now, but it doesn't mean that when we sit back and think, what's great, like that immediately springs to mind. So that's a conundrum, I think, for artists.
I have a question about the iPad. I don't know that the Damien Hirst controversy has anything to do with the iPad, but it does strike me that the breadth of what he is offering and the way it's being offered couldn't have happened without it. So just wondering about that.
To me, it's not so much the iPad, and it's more the invention in 1992 of the JPEG standard, which became the ubiquitous standard that people use to compress a digital image to something that can go somewhere. And then in 2001, Google creating the Google search image solution. So between those two things, you can now, oh my gosh, you can become an art history expert pretty quickly. So I think JPEG and Google Images, to me,
Plus
are...
iPhone.
Yeah, iPhone, yeah.
And that he's been able to circulate the images to
It's
museums and collectors in advance through JPEG, through these.
Right.
I mean, it used to be transparencies, right?
Right.
Or
Right,
slides. You'd
yeah,
pack up a
yes,
slide and mail it
yes.
off.
Make a package.
You segmented your audience by slide, 4 by 5
Photocopies,
and 8 by
yeah.
10. The whales got the 8 by 10s.
So funny.
I hadn't thought about that, you're right.
Good question.
Actually, question pertaining to the Dallas Art Fair. Over its still relatively brief history, we've seen significant growth, really year by year, of that fair. And I imagine one could attribute that to roughly two classes of things. One factor is internal to Dallas and the fair itself, characteristics of the market here. And secondly, at a sort of macro level, factors outside of Dallas in the ecology of art fairs. And so I'm just wondering, coming from outside Dallas, could you talk about some of those external fairs? What does the growth of a fair like this say about the evolution of fairs overall, and what does it point to their future?
Would you like me to take that one?
Sure.
So by way of background, we have worked with Art Basel in Switzerland for 21 years and then globally since that time in 1996. So we have a pretty good purview on the art fair landscape. I think that, and I hesitate to use the word regional, but that is loosely what we refer to, art fairs in cities like Dallas or Chicago. They are incredibly important, and I think what's important about them is they're an opportunity for people in these communities, in a community like Dallas that does have a rich history of arts patronage, of arts collecting, for more people to be reached, to come in to have art experiences, not just the collectors, but the burgeoning collectors, newer collectors, younger collectors, or the general public that want to have art experiences that are reflective of the market, which can bring along with it a snapshot of what's happening today in the art world. And so, and it also can engage with local galleries who can then go on and apply for the more international shows around the world. So again, very important part of the art world ecosystem. It's also incredibly fun for people to come in from other cities and really get to know a city, and we don't often have the opportunity to do that beyond these sort of hotspot moments in Venice or Basel or New York. And so a show like Dallas or Expo Chicago in September, I think are very, very important and will continue to be an important platform in the market.
I think I agree, but at the same time, not all of them will. I think Dallas is a unique case too, because like you were saying, there's a rich history of patronage. There are some really major collectors here who are very generous and whose collections also are incredibly respected. So there's different levels within that. You can have people interested, and then you can have buyers, and then you can have collectors, and that distinguishment is really their eye, how good the advice they've been getting is, how long they've been holding on to things. Also, there is a museum infrastructure here. So there's several cultural offerings in Dallas that take it beyond plonking an art fair anywhere. So I think the fair here is specific to Dallas. It works because of Dallas, because there is continuous interest here. And for all of the things that Sara mentioned, you can grow markets, you can bring new people in. It's great to have a reason to come to Dallas and see things. on a specific weekend as opposed to choosing a weekend of your own. So being led in that way is helpful. And also the fact that there are major collectors here means that it sort of bring the mountain to Moses. If the dealers, I'm sure, are hoping that some of those major collectors will swing by their booth. And you can always tell whether a dealer's had a good fair if they say to you, oh, it's great, we've made loads of sales, or if they say, it's great, we had loads of interest, because interest means I haven't sold anything and I'm really worried about my costs. So you want a mix of both. And whereas we have seen a proliferation of art fairs, and I don't think all of them will survive, because some of them are just outside that city. Other cities have their own problems. I think New York is actually a very difficult city to have an art fair in, because you're competing with New York. You're competing with all of the culture that goes on, the museums, the land, there isn't much land, the taxis, like everything. People maybe want to go see a show, they want to try this new restaurant. There's too much going on in New York for people to really focus on an art fair, but that's the kind of nut that no one's really been able to crack. LA has its own particular problems because of traffic, largely, and where you would even hold a fair that people would go to, and keeps trying and does have successful art fairs, but it's not the same as Basel, where they've taken people out of there. There's not much to do in Basel, apart from go to the art fair, so you kind of have this captive audience. And
there's great museums.
There are great museums,
like
and there's
Dallas.
the art fair. But that's exactly the thing. There are people there who really are serious. There's an infrastructure and that's predated the event. But aside from that, it's not like you're kind of hopping off to a Broadway show when you're in Switzerland. You go for a meal, you have an early night, and it's nice to do that.
Well, I think at this point we'd like to thank you all for coming, and thank our panelists for their insight and input.
And thank you for being a great moderator.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And there will be wine somewhere.
On the garden terrace for a wine reception.
I want a glass.
Thank you.